Anne Applebaum, welcome to Mexico.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And we're very pleased to have you here. Many of us have followed your work for years, and we're introducing you to a Mexican audience that I hope will follow you as avidly as I do and many others do. You wrote a wonderful book that my students read and that is actually selling very well in Mexico because it seems to speak to something that is happening worldwide. The book is called Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, where you write about polarized societies, profound divides, democracy under threat. What compelled you to write it? What is happening in the world and in countries that you know about that led you to write this book at this time?
In fact, the inspiration for the book was my own experience. I live part of the time in Poland. My husband is Polish, has been a Polish politician. I live part of the time in the US, which is, I'm American, it's where I'm from. I spent many years living in England. And I found in all three countries, I suddenly realized that the political system or the political divides were shifting and that I was losing friends. And that people who I had once thought were on my side in various different kinds of arguments about politics, about what was a good government, were suddenly on the other side and in a very aggressive and angry way. Then I thought, well, has this ever happened before? And I went back and I read historical books about past period. I looked a lot at the Dreyfus case in France, which was a time when alliances shifted in French politics, and I looked at the 1930s. And the book is a product of that. I do think we're living in an era when the old political divides, what we used to call the right and what we used to call the left, no longer make that much sense. And the arguments in many democracies, in the US, in Poland, in Britain, and in Mexico, are now being reorganized along new lines, and the dividing lines are different, and the book was an attempt to understand what that was.
So the divides are now authoritarianism versus democracy. And that is creating a different set of cleavages. When I read the book, it resonated with me because in the last 4 years under this administration, I feel that the people that I used to have dinner with, I used to march with, we shared the same ideas, we were on the same side of progressive causes against militarization or in favor of human rights. These are people that I no longer speak to, who we don't consider ourselves friends anymore. And as you describe in your book, you would actually walk on the other side of the street to avoid talking to them.
Yes, no, I had a very similar experience. I mean, I come from a different political orientation from you. I would have described myself in the past as center-right. But the center-right in America, in Poland, in Britain, and many other places has split. In America, it was about Trump. You were pro-Trump, or you were anti-Trump, or you were an anti-Trump Republican. And those cleavages were very, very bitter because people felt they were about very existential things. So, that Trump genuinely offended many conservatives who felt that, their belief in the rule of law, their idea about, America's role in the world, all the things that they thought were intrinsic to their definition of who they were ignored or changed or even spat upon by Trump. And so they, it created a divide that was unbridgeable. And I had a similar experience in other countries.
And I feel that we're living through that now, where suddenly issues of preserving democracy, rule of law, freedom of expression, divided government, checks and balances that weren't really the common fights of the past are now the common fights.
Right. We thought we didn't need to fight about those things because we agreed about them. The left and the right agreed about that, and we were fighting about other things. We were fighting about the size of the state. We were fighting about social issues, we were fighting about other things. And now it turns out that these things we thought were not part of the dispute are disputed. And that creates new lines because some people, it turns out, think that rule of law, is the most important, is fundamental to our society. And it turns out that other people whom we agreed with about, tax cuts, don't think so.
Right. And in Mexico, this is reflected in, do you want to defend democracy and the rule of law insofar as it has existed, or we want that possibility to continue, or are you on the side of the president and his movement? And that's become the cleavage. This is specific to Mexico, but as you've written in your book, it's a global phenomenon. Why is this happening?
There are a number of reasons. I don't have a single explanation. You can look at, there's an economic cause there. I think after the financial crisis in 2008, especially, the sense of disappointment in the economic system, that we thought was perfect, or we thought was not perfect, or we thought was rational, we thought was based on run by people who knew what they were doing. There was a sense of disappointment in that. I think there's also because of the speed of change. We now live in an unbelievably fast-moving time when so much of life is being transferred from the real world to the online world. Conversation, entertainment, news, and so many other things. That many people increasingly have a sense of loss
and dislocation.
So there was a world that we used to live in, that I grew up in, and my children's world is so different. There's this extreme forms of change, and nobody's offering us a guidepost through them. And it's always true in history that when you have a time of rapid change, or when you have violence, or when you have revolution, you have a part of society wants to end it, and they want one conversation, one leader. They don't want to hear this angry debate.
They don't want the chaos of democracy. I've heard you say that that's why after the French Revolution you got Napoleon.
That's right. So you have the French Revolution, and then immediately afterwards you have a dictatorship, in fact. And we live in a time that's like that. So there's a combination, as I said, of disappointment with the way things have gone, or the failure of promised changes, combined with this anger and distress at the amount of change. And I think one of the things I write up in the book is the role that played by nostalgia. This idea that there was once a better time, and there was a time that was more peaceful and more normal and more quiet, and children grew up in a different way, and we want that time back. But in order to get that time back, we have to smash up the present, because you can't go backwards in time without destroying the institutions that we have now.
And in Mexico, we're living this insofar as there's a disappointment with the transition to democracy, that it didn't deliver, that it didn't solve social injustice issues, that our democracy was elitist or farcical, and that disappointment is now manifesting itself in a desire to return to what we had before.
Yes.
A strong leader, centralized government, decisions taken from above. And there's an element of anger, resentment, and nostalgia.
So I hate to, every country believes itself to be unique, and of course they are, and there are things about Mexico that are not similar to anywhere else, but this is a very similar description I would give about Poland or Hungary, for example. The idea that democratic transition was insufficient, it didn't give us what we wanted. And very often it's not even so much ordinary people who think that, there's a part of the elite that believes that. So there's a part of the elite that says, I worked for the democratic transition. I expected to be, president or prime minister by now, or I would at least be a best-selling author or something, and I didn't get that. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to destroy it, and I'm going to substitute a new system whereby we bring back a one-party state, and the one-party state will promote me.
Or that we're going to incorporate people who never had been part of the elite before. Because the discourse now in Mexico has been very anti-elitist, anti-expert, anti-establishment. And yet when you look at the results, what seems paradoxical to me is that this smashing of the elites, it's really rhetoric, because you're actually getting just the substitution of one elite by another elite.
Of course, and
that is just as privileged.
Of course, and that second elite has a lot of interest in smashing whatever. And even elite is a hard word, is a strange word, because very often the elites we're talking about are not the wealthiest people in society. They're not even the most influential. They're just the people who make easy targets, or the people who talk a lot.
One of the things I found very interesting about the book is you write about how authoritarianism or the seductive allure of authoritarianism needs a series of clerks, you call them. Explain the word to us, please.
So it's a word that comes from a book that was written in the 1930s. And it was written by a Frenchman, actually, who was disillusioned by the number of intellectual friends of his who were attracted to, at that time, totalitarian ideologies, so to fascism or to communism. And the book was about how they, the people who had had an independent intellectual existence instead became attracted to those systems. And he analyzes why, and there are many reasons, some of which we've just discussed. People feel disappointment, they feel resentment, they feel, that there's a different system they could be part of. And this word seemed to me very applicable to people I know in Poland who had been independent intellectuals and then somehow became servants of the state with very little independent thought or feeling.
Right, and you say these are writers, analysts, YouTubers, people who are on social media who are seduced by authoritarianism.
Yes, well, a lot of talk is, a lot of books and thinking is focused on autocrats. Who are they? What kind of personalities they have and so on. Much less is focused on the people who facilitate the autocrats, because they don't get to power by themselves. They get to power with
and they're
the help.
Sustained in office by this cadre of people who disseminate the narrative, who support and justify everything the leader does.
Right. And who are those people? Those people are very well educated. Those people are good at words. Those people are talented publicists. Those people come from the world of talk and conversation and intellectual life, and those are the people who need to facilitate the dictator. And in every political system that has an autocracy, you find people like that. And also in systems where, like the ones we're talking about, that aren't pure autocracies. We're not talking about totalitarian systems. We're talking about democracies that are in decline, or that are under attack, or that are being undermined by somebody in power. And that process of undermining the democracy requires a lot of people to help. It requires lawyers, journalists, publicists, many different kinds of people need to be part of that process. It's, we often act like it's the autocrat by himself, and we spend a lot of time talking, about Trump or
and his psychology,
his way of thinking, and his language, and so on. But actually, he can't function without a group of people who want to make, who create his press conferences, or who create his propaganda, or who create his social media campaigns.
I'm thinking in terms of my own experience. I wrote a book several years ago that was illustrated by one of the main cartoonists in this country, who at that point was very much against, it was pro-democracy and against authoritarian practices, abuses of power. He is now a complete supporter of the government, and all the cartoons that he makes are either about me or about the opposition. And we no longer speak to each other. Or a former, a minister of the Supreme Court who used to come to my house to dinner and then became very close to the president, and we no longer speak. So this is leading to very polarized societies, and to the creation of facilitators, and to the opposition suddenly being people that you would not have normally been associated with.
Yes, so one of the ways to fight this, or really one of the ways to live through it and be sane, is to create new coalitions. So, the old left-right division that once characterized our politics and our conversations, you have to forget about it. Because now your allies, if you're on the left, you're going to find that people who are on the right but dislike the right-wing dictator are your friends, or vice versa. If you're on the right, you might find that people who are on the left and who dislike the left-wing dictator are your friends. And so one of the things we need to be thinking more creatively about is what are these new coalitions? What do they look like? What language do they use? Even relearning effective campaigning and communication. Because we're really, the old ways in which we did things and the ways in which we spoke and communicated and wrote might not work anymore. Because they derive, first of all, they derive from a pre-social media era of politics. And they also derive from an era, a different kind of conversation. So what's the new conversation and who are the new alliances is something that needs to be discussed.
And it creates all kinds of weird coalitions that oftentimes feel very uncomfortable to be marching as someone of the left with the people that you decried when they were in office, the old PRI priistas that were responsible for the authoritarian system of the past, and now suddenly you're allies in trying to prevent a regression to the past.
Yes, no, we have the same experience in Poland, that some former communists who emerged, reformed, became Democrats, participated in electoral democracy, were responsible for Poland joining NATO or for joining the European Union. I mean, those people who we fought against for years and years, and people we know went to prison under communism, those are often better allies than people who were once our friends in the anti-communist movement, because they are willing to stand up and speak out against against the undermining of democracy that the ruling party is currently carrying out.
You write in the book that given the right conditions, any society can turn against democracy. And when I read that sentence, I thought, this is reflective of the lives of many of us in Mexico who fought for an electoral transition and thought, that's it, we got there. We can improve, there are all these problems that have to be solved, in terms of checks and balances and in terms of accountability, we're not there yet, but at the very minimum, we have this electoral democracy. And now even that seems under threat, and it feels like, why are we fighting the same battle that we thought we'd won 30 years ago?
So anybody who ever studied democracy, at least certainly in ancient times, in ancient Greece or Rome, and right up almost to the present, understood that democracy was a constant challenge and battle, that it was never guaranteed. I mean, Aristotle wrote about democracy being a system that declines and degenerates, and that's thousands of years ago. And I think many of us were misled by the incredible success of liberal democracy, first of all after 1945 in Europe, but then after 1989 in many other countries.
After the fall of the
Berlin Wall in 1989, the end of communism, the sort of end of the Cold War. And that moment felt to many like the triumph of liberal democracy, and liberal democracy felt inevitable. Why did we even have to talk about it anymore? Because it was always going to be here. It was like water coming out of the tap. It was guaranteed. We didn't have to think about it or worry about it. And I think many people acted in that way. They said, well, democracy is something that will always be here, so why do I have to care about it? It's something for professional politicians. I can get on with my life, and I can paint paintings or do business or do something else, and it's not my problem. Somebody else will think about it. Actually, democracy is a system that is by definition always challenged. It by definition always needs renewal. And by definition, if you care about it, you might have to be part of it. You might have to go get the water from the well and make bring the water into your house.
Carry the basket.
Carry the basket because it's something that won't happen automatically.
You might actually have to go out and defend your electoral institutions.
You might actually have to do that. You might have to participate in politics. You might have to join a local political party or even just a local neighborhood council. I'm not saying everybody has to run for president, but being engaged might be something you have to do if you care about just preserving the political system that we have.
Right. And so you've been here for a couple of days. What have you found about Mexico? Because I've heard you say this all sounds familiar.
So it's true that the conversation about having an elected government, sometimes it's a ruling party, sometimes it's a president, who is angry about the electoral system, who seeks to undermine it or who seeks to change it. This is very familiar. We have this in Poland. We have this in the United States. We have this in Brazil under Trump. That's right. So it's now a very familiar part of contemporary politics. So some of the conversations sound very much the same, but also some of the dilemmas for the opponents of those changes also sound the same to me. we've just talked about them. Who do you work with? How do you create a new coalition?
Do you create a united front of opposition parties,
Right.
or do they compete on their own? What's the role of citizens? What's the role of civil
Right.
society?
Right, and but that conversation is being had all over the world. It's even I would say even in countries that haven't been where an autocratic or an autocratic leaning party has not taken over, they still matter because those kinds of political parties now feature really in every democratic system. Even France, Germany, Sweden. The Netherlands. Countries that you think of as very stable democracies are all facing that same kind of rhetoric. Sometimes it's not people who are in power, but it's the same kind of language in politics. And so, thinking about how to oppose it if you come from an establishment party or if you've been in power before, it can be just as difficult.
Which is the dilemma currently for the former ruling PRI and the National Action Party.
Right.
So you've done comparative work on democratic erosion, and they're in the book. So why Mexico? Suddenly part of your mental map. Why now?
Mexico, clearly a country that's dealing with many of the same issues. I had been following it from afar for some time and reading about the nature of the political system. And really anywhere where you have the leaders attacking journalists, attacking judges, using these kinds of expressions about elites, seeking to create the impression that he stands for the real people and that somehow other Mexicans are fake people or they're not Mexican. This is, again, a very familiar kind of rhetoric, and we've heard that rhetoric again before in almost every single established democracy. And so looking at it in Mexico for me is like looking at the same problem from a different angle.
So, and just as a parting question, and thank you very much for your time and bringing this comparative perspective to Mexico's readers. You are going off to Ukraine in 2 weeks. And this goes back to the argument of democracies can be under threat at any time. In this case, it's a foreign invasion. But we saw in Ukraine a movement to protect democracy with the Maidan uprising, and now everything seems so in flux and dangerous, and the future of democracy at stake, not only in Ukraine, but as many people have said, democracy in the West. So what do you think is going to happen in your trip? What interests you? How do you see that playing out?
So Ukraine is a fascinating example of a society that has really consolidated around the idea of liberal democracy. And it's not a country that is historically democratic at all, nor is it a country that historically united. It's very divided. It's got regional divides. It's got 2 different languages. That is, most people are bilingual. Very complicated country. And the attack of Russia on Ukraine has suddenly made people realize they need to argue for these values, and also to understand that sometimes they might need to fight for them.
And that literally means fight. As
literally
in going
means
out.
fight for your homes and fight
Right.
for your families. In a way, I think nobody there expected. People theoretically knew there might be a Russian invasion, but no one expected this kind of brutality. And I think the Ukrainian struggle has been very inspiring to others in the democratic world. Whether it's in Washington or Brussels or Paris or Berlin or Mexico City, a lot of people I think are able to look at that and see that could be me or that could be my society. And one of the reasons why the Western world, which I think was very skeptical about Ukraine's ability to defend itself, one of the reasons why the decision has been made to help them is that people have begun to understand that that struggle is related to our struggle. We're not all in danger of being invaded by Russia, but we are all facing that kind of existential challenge to our values and to our to our societies.
What democracy means.
And to what democracy means. Democracy means and sovereignty in the sense of our ability to decide for ourselves and contribute to deciding what kind of a society that we want to live in. Do we want to be able to have an active role in society, or do we want someone else to come and tell us how to behave?
Well, Anne, thank you very much. I hope that the next time you're in Mexico, it's to discuss a book entitled The Survival of Democracy and how we saved the world from the seductive lure of authoritarianism, because there is a common thread.
Yes.
That is, I think, regrettably going around the world.
Yes.
A pleasure to have you, and as I've said to you time and again, we are doing our best to Mexicanize you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.